So there are a couple things that I can take a look at here with you. So if I could have you create a grid in your notebook here. So we'll want to create 3 columns and then 4 rows. So the first big thing that has helped me in helping people reduce anxiety, depression, experiences of trauma, recurrence of nightmares, things of that nature, is to look at these experiences through a slightly different lens than traditional psychiatry would. So instead of looking at, say, anxiety or PTSD as a permanent sort of lifelong mental illness, the way I look at it is, of course, it's very real, right? So I'm not saying it's like made up by any means. Of course, you are experiencing this. It is an involuntary response in the nervous system. But the way in which I look at it is that it is a conditioned automatic response in the nervous system. And as you obviously know from your behavioral background, we can condition and train new responses, right, to our environment, of course. And then what I believe as well is that we can train and condition new responses even to the stimuli of our own thoughts and things of that nature. And that's kind of where my background goes. So what I find to be a very useful first step is to deconstruct the mental pattern of trauma or deconstruct the mental pattern of anxiety, whatever it is the person's dealing with, in a much more specific way. And the little sort of simplistic metaphor I usually teach people is I like to think of it as learning what all of the little buttons are inside of your brain. Because if you can learn what all of those buttons are and you can learn kind of a basic user's manual of what makes you feel traumatized, what makes you feel, panicky, etc., then of course you can learn to train yourself to no longer push the red buttons, as I call them, the ones that will make you feel how you don't want to feel, and instead you can learn how to push the blue buttons instead. There are 3 kind of big chunks of, I call them micro patterns, things that we can actually learn how to control if we dial in on them. That's what these rows represent. So that first row is going to be a header row. The other 3 rows represent these sort of 3 main buckets of, if you think of it as red buttons, so to speak, okay? So we'll make the top left box will be blank, nothing will go in there. Top center box would be the label for the emotion or the feeling that you are trying to minimize or reduce, get rid of in your life. So it could be traumatized, it could be panic. And by the way, one tiny tip I would recommend for you is one trap that people get into, particularly if they have a background of addressing their mental health through traditional psychiatry, is all of the language and the focus becomes around the problem. So for example, if it's anxiety, we always talk in terms of, yes, I want to get rid of my anxiety, I want to reduce anxiety, I need to stop feeling anxiety, so to speak. The challenge with going at it that way, I find, is that that'd be very much like if I said to you, please stop thinking about a purple elephant right now. And if you're thinking about a purple elephant right now, I need you to try even harder to not think about that purple elephant. So it's a small shift, but a very powerful shift. So rather than I want to reduce anxiety, I find that people will start to improve if they go, I want to increase the amount of time that I'm feeling content. And putting your attention on how do I magnify feeling content works a lot better. Let me, if I could, I will take you through a tiny little mental process here so we can get a few answers that might empower you. So I'll invite you to close your eyes for a second. I am going to give you a little warning that the next 2 or 3 minutes will be slightly uncomfortable, but they will reveal some information that will be useful for you. Okay. So what we're going to do here is I want you to imagine that you're back in an experience where you were feeling panicked. So what I'll have you do then is instead of reliving it, I will need to have you remember a few things about that experience though. When you were in that experience, right as soon as the anxiety started or the feeling of panic occurred, there would have been, in particular, your mind would have fixated on something. So what will happen very often is one thing that may have occurred is your mind may have started to imagine something bad happening in the very imminent future, like being attacked or assaulted, or it can very often just be having a panic attack itself becomes the thing that you become worried about. You may know this as well from your training, right? But to the functional system inside of our nervous system that makes up our world, what we vividly imagine is not really easily parsed from what is actually real, right? That's why our dreams feel so real, because they're not even competing with our actual stimuli in the world around us. So if we vividly visualize something taking place from the past, we'll feel pretty much very akin or similar to how we felt in that moment in the past, right? It can feel almost like a disassociative experience. Okay, so you start hyperventilating, shaking, creating some tension in some of your muscle groups, I would imagine, sort of tensing up. And then we're done with the nasty parts, okay? So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and take a nice, very deep breath in through your nose. Just fill your lungs entirely, and then take a nice exhale out through your mouth. And as you do so, keep your eyes closed. But now what I'd like you to do is I want you to remember visually a moment where you really felt content. Okay, being in a setting and a situation where you really felt really content, even if it was a long time ago. Okay, great. Now what I'd like you to do is go ahead now and imagine that you are right back in that moment, as in you are in your body. You're seeing out of your eyes what you were seeing then. I want you to remember 3 or 4 unique visual details from that moment that made it feel really special. You don't need to say them, but just remember them. Okay, and as you recall the visual details, I want you to remember how it felt, right? The feelings that you had in that moment. Okay, and just imagine you're right back there. You're giving yourself a little mental vacation. And then recall one other place that brought you a lot of joy. Something maybe a little more exotic, like a place you visited, perhaps. Some unique environment that was really interesting to you. And I want you to remember being in that place visually, right? So you're back in your body and think of all of the things that you saw. Try to remember all of the things you saw that were really interesting to you. Okay, so now you can slowly bring your awareness back to the room. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go quickly, because my goal is to add as much value as I can in a short period of time. And we're going to jot some things down in this table of yours, this grid of yours. Okay, now I had to take a little extra time to do things a little indirectly with you, because obviously your pattern is a very intense pattern, at least it is right now. And there's no shame in that, and there's nothing wrong with that. All that just means is that it can go from kind of 0 to 100 fairly quickly. There are some ways to mitigate that pattern, however. We have here is you would have a nervous system that we would categorize as VAK, okay, which stands for visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and that order is important. What that means is that the way in which your brain is processing information is that it is creating pictures in the mind first and foremost. Once it creates pictures in the mind, and this is something that I would have to dig into a little bit later on to totally verify. I'm not going to take the time to do it right now because this is not that consequential. I'm a little unsure whether it's auditory next for you and then kinesthetic. That's my hunch, because that's usually how it goes. There are a rare percentage of people that are VKA, which would mean you have a visualization, you then have a kinesthetic experience, and then the auditory comes third. That may be the case for you. That's a little bit semantical, so that doesn't matter so much. The most important part of this piece of information, though, is that your mind processes firstly in images. All right, and so why that it becomes important is people who have a visually oriented nervous system first are a little bit more susceptible to storing traumatic experiences and reliving them until they learn how to train the brain in a slightly different way. Okay? It doesn't mean that you're destined to feel traumatized for the rest of your life. It just means that it's just information that will help you. Okay? So what we have to do, in short, my very first priority is to make sure that we can help you stop the visual repetition of the reliving of these memories, because that is essentially like the linchpin of this entire pattern. Or you could think of it like the ignition switch that turns on an engine, right? The engine literally cannot and will not start unless the ignition switch is turned. For you, the ignition switch is a very particular sequence visually, okay? So what I'd like you to do here is in this panicked column, okay, the very first box under the word panic, I'm going to have you jot down several bullet points. Okay, the first bullet point is you're going to write down past plus fear. So very simply, What happens that makes you feel panicky? The very first thing is you focus on the past and something from the past that you fear, as opposed to, for example, focusing on something you fear taking place in the future, which comes a couple milliseconds later. All right, so the very first thing is the past plus fear. Now, the way in which you focus on the past plus fear, here's your next bullet point, is you focus on it in the first person in a color series of images. And then another important, all of these things I'm having you write down, by the way, are what we call submodalities. They're essentially specific characteristics about how your brain processes information. Okay, the next one is that it is on a loop, it is repetitive. Okay, and that is important as well. And the only thing I didn't ask you is the speed at which they are repeating, but I would have to imagine it's fairly quick, that it's kind of flipping through these snippets pretty quickly. So that would be your final bullet point there, is the tempo is fast. Now I'm going to try a couple of little experiments with you here, because this is probably the information that will give you the biggest bang for your buck here. So there's probably one particular image out of that series of images that might stick out a little bit more than the rest. Just because you're feeling panicky in this moment in time, that doesn't mean that you're unsafe. I know you feel uncomfortable. I would just encourage you to remind yourself that it's okay that you feel a little uncomfortable right now. There's nothing unsafe about this experience, even though it's slightly uncomfortable, and it's going to lead to some information that will be very helpful for you. Okay, so what I want to do is I have about 4 or 5 little micro experiments to see how we can reduce the experience of anxiety. I'll need you to just act on a small piece of information where we can take that old negative memory and see if we can get it diminished. So what I'd like you to do is, I want you to take one image from that experience. Okay, and what I'd like you to do is, I want you to just go ahead and do this. I want you to white the image out. And what will help you, by the way, is take whichever is your dominant hand, reach out in front of you, and imagine you are grabbing a knob. So literally grab that knob, turn the knob, and as you turn the knob, white that image out until it becomes completely blank and white. Okay, so you can do it. It's just challenging. I need to give you a direct recommendation right now. I know you're in a lot of pain. This is not going to happen overnight. Okay, my goal is, of course, to make sure that you do not continue to experience pain. The fastest way that we can make ourselves feel very, very panicky, well, not the fastest way, but a very fast way, is using the word can't. I know that currently that's how it feels. I know that it feels that way. The challenge is that when we tell ourselves, I can't, I can't, I can't, I can't, I can't, which we've now learned is kind of one of those dominant language patterns for you, it sort of becomes like self-hypnosis. So rather than can't, okay, and in fact, I've given this instruction to clients in the past where I have told them, use any other word except can't. You can say, I struggle to. You can say it's difficult to. I'm currently learning how to, etc. But I've instructed people in the past, just simply remove the word can't from your vocabulary. And every time I've had someone actually follow through on that, their anxiety level has dropped. Sometimes less, sometimes more. But that is the first most concrete thing you could do that will decrease your anxiety levels. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is, if the image pops up for you, just practice immediately bringing it whited out. Like, imagine, you could even think of like a white piece of paper completely covering it, if you like, would be a simple way to do it. You don't need to do it in a prolonged way. Just if it pops up, just immediately white it out. Okay, and as you immediately white it out, does that help diminish the experience even a small amount? It's probably not going to be a huge amount, but does that diminish it at all? And you also know that with a lot of your students, they may feel very reactive for something because their nervous system, their mind is doing something that is currently outside of their control. It's sort of an impulsive, immediate reaction. But you also know that there's a very large area of influence that we can have over our behaviors, over our responses to things, if we learn the right skills, right? It is challenging and it is difficult, it's uncomfortable. The one big thing that makes things more challenging, though, is our desire for it to be more comfortable than it is. I've seen that people will create a lot more anxiety for themselves when they wish the experience to be more comfortable than it's inevitably going to be. So I am in no way saying, hey, just be fine with it, right? That would be a ludicrous thing to say. I'm also not saying you immediately need to flip a switch and feel better right this second, because that'd be unrealistic. All I'm reminding and encouraging you to do is that if you can build the skill set of remembering that just because you're uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that you are unsafe. Discomfort does not mean danger inherently. So here's the challenge I have. I want to give you a couple things that you can begin to practice with on your own time if you decide you want to go forward on your own. This is a very challenging thing to deal with on your own. You've experienced that as well too. If you were wanting to just go forward on your own, here are a couple things that you can start to try to do that are not going to be the full solution for you, but will at least give you some ways to start reducing the panic. The one would be adjusting the perspective. So essentially what you'd want to do is try to manipulate each one of these submodalities, right? And there are ways that we can teach you how to do that. But one would be changing the perspective. So from first person to instead be third person, for example. Okay. The second would be the brightness, right? So you can either make it dark and dim, like very difficult to see, or very, very bright. That usually has a very powerful emotional trigger. Typically, if you brighten up a positive visualization, that will bring a lot more joy and content. And then if you essentially make a negative picture essentially very, very bright to the point that you can't even see it, and you practice that, we call that a scrambling process, then you can end up diminishing that particular pattern. The other one you can do is speed. Okay, so one thing that you can experiment with and learn to do is if your mind is trying to generate those images, one of the things that creates overwhelm and panic is the speed and the tempo at which your brain is trying to process information. So this may not sound like it would work, but 2/3 of the time we find that this tends to help, is if you work on slowing down that sensation. So for example, like freezing the image. So instead of a movie, it's like just a still image. Or instead of a series of images that are running through your mind very quickly, you start to slow them down, right? And practice slowing them down. Now, some of those you will try and they will make you feel better. There will be one or two of those that might make you feel slightly worse, but you have to do the experiment to figure out which ones actually create a little bit of a better sensation. With the reactivity you're feeling towards your negative memory, it's totally understandable that it's going to take a little time and a little patience with yourself, okay?